I want to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs and the University of Iowa's honors program. They both are vital to our programming as they contribute time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and today's special sponsors, Usha Balakrishnan and Midwest One Bank. I'm going to hand it over to my dear friend and fellow Rotarian, who is known to so many of you in the community, Usha R. Balakrishnan. Usha.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tice. It is my pleasure to introduce Corey Creekmur, who's an associate professor in the University of Iowa Department of Cinematic Arts, English and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Study. Corey's research and teaching interests include American and Indian cinema, American popular culture, including crime fiction and comics, and representations of gender and sexuality in popular media. Corey serves on a number of local boards, including Filmscene, and he edits a book series on comics for Rutgers University. I don't think it is on Indian cinema comics. For an Indian American diaspora woman like me, who grew up in India for her first 20 years and has lived in America for the next 32 years, I can very well empathize with the title of Corey's talk today about the invisibility of popular Indian cinema in America. I'm truly pleased to welcome Professor Corey Creekmur.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here. Let me preface this by saying I did presume little, if no, knowledge of Indian cinema or popular Indian cinema on the audience's part. I realize there are people in the room, including Usha and my former Hindi teacher, Philip Letkendorf, who have often, Philip and I have often taught Hindi film courses together. People who, I have nothing to tell them that's new, but I'm presuming that this is a relatively new or unknown topic to many of you. And I'll also say, I hope not in presentational style, but this is a little bit of a grumpy talk on my part. It's something I've been puzzling about for some time now, as long as I've been interested in popular Indian cinema, why it seems to me, with ups and downs, but it seems to me to remain a fairly unknown topic in the United States. And so I'm going to talk less about Indian cinema per se. I'm going to not say much about its characteristics, what distinguishes it. I'd be happy to answer questions along those lines, but I am going to talk about this sort of curious obscurity that it seems to have in the U.S. And I'm going to try to emphasize in brief ways that this is not to cast blame, certainly on anyone in the room. This is, I think the reasons that Hindi, I'm going to talk primarily about Hindi cinema, remains little known in the U.S. is not out of lack of interest, or this is not to say it's any particular person's fault here. There are structural reasons for this. There are institutional reasons for this, and that's what I want to emphasize. First, I'm going to, though, talk about the fact that there's a certain amount of confusion about the object of study. What is Indian cinema? There are Indian film festivals now all around the world. I know the screen is a bit small, but maybe you can tell there's Los Angeles, Vietnam, Montreal. These exist in other places. But relying on a kind of common sense understanding of what Indian cinema is, comparable to what German cinema is or what French cinema is, can cause some confusion. It's a very unstable term for reasons I think are worth spending some time on. First, and I'll mention this now and circle back to this topic, we should distinguish between at least, and this is not a subtle distinction, and it could be more subtle, between popular cinema, mainstream cinema, commercial cinema, and art cinema. Like I said, this will be a topic I'll come back to. I've selected here two of the best-known representatives of popular cinema, Hindi cinema in this case, and art cinema, the most famous Bengali example. Many of you will know that another complication is that Indian cinema probably should always be referred to as Indian cinemas. There are multiple cinemas. This is true in some case for many national cinemas, in the sense that many national cinemas have a popular cinema, say, and an art cinema. But when we talk about French cinema, for all the diversity within that category that you might find, we are talking about a body of films in the French language, or German cinema. Even when we had to talk about East and West German cinemas, we're talking about a body of cinema in the same language, and across the century that those cinemas have existed. Indian cinema exists in a dozen or more distinct languages. And so you've got the only sort of comparable example, and it's not comparable in some ways, is the category of Chinese cinema, which can refer to films from the People's Republic, films from Taiwan, and films from Hong Kong. But the status of Taiwan and Hong Kong is, of course, distinct in ways that the status of the regions or the states of India are not. So the states of a unified nation, but identified by different languages. Again, I realize some of you can't see this, but this is a map, not a complete map by any means, but a map that identifies the main language regions. And there are significant cinemas in, significantly large cinemas in, say, 3 or 4 of those, and then smaller, what are commonly called regional cinemas. That term deserves some consideration itself, but what are called regional cinemas. And so there is a very large body of, across a number of regions or languages, South Indian cinema. South Indian cinema is fascinating for its own reasons, in part because of long ties between South Indian politics and South Indian cinema. There's a now long tradition of Indian film stars moving into politics in South India. Again, a rich topic I'm not going to have much to say about. So here is some information on last year that this is perhaps imperfect. This sort of data is hard sometimes to find in very precise ways, but I think this is largely accurate. So around 1,500 films made in India last year. And the largest number, this is typical of any given year, in the major languages of Hindi, Telugu, and Tamil, although a significant number of films in Kannada, Bengali, other languages, and then there's a kind of other category. So to emphasize, this is not complete. This is not every language in which a film in India was released last year. I'll come back to the numbers in a little bit, but I wanted to emphasize the linguistic diversity at this point. A historical question I'll just raise quickly. What do we call cinema made in India by Indians for Indians before the contemporary nation of India existed? What do we call cinema made under colonial British India? Is that Indian cinema? This has been a question, and it may seem like a picky one in ways, but it's been a question raised by film scholars. What do we do with pre-independent Indian cinema in terms of categorization? It was subject to British censorship rules. It was subject to British regulations. The British paid a lot of attention to it in some cases, ignored it in others. But in this case, a film about the life of the child Krishna, you have from very early on Indian cinema that deals with distinctly Indian cultural topics. How do we think about that cinema? This is a well-known ad that appeared at the Times of India in 1896. This is by almost everyone's estimation, the first screening of films in India at a hotel, Watson's Hotel in Bombay. This is a major moment in Indian film history, but it's commonly understood there were likely no Indians in the audience. The only Indians attending were probably the service staff, fixing up gin and tonic for the audience that was there to see French films. So the Indianness of this, despite its sort of crucial kind of foundational moment in Indian film history, is an issue. So we have very interesting films with key figures in the history of Indian cinema, the stunt queen named Fearless Nadia, the superstar who arrives by the 1970s, Amitabh Bachchan. We have colonial and independent cinema constituting, the fact that India becomes independent in roughly the middle of the 20th century means that it bisects the history of cinema, which is largely the history of the 20th century. So there's a historical question to be raised just about identifying something as Indian cinema. There's also a category that probably is best understood as diasporic cinema. Cinema that is often taken to be Indian, but in some important sense is not. So Meera Nair's film, Monsoon Wedding, a number of years ago, someone like me, who people know works on Indian cinema, would commonly say to me, "Oh, I saw an Indian film." Or I'll anticipate where I'm going. I haven't raised this word yet. I saw a Bollywood film, and I'd say, "Oh, terrific, what is it?" "Monsoon Wedding." And I would usually just smile and ask if they liked it. But it's an international co-production. It did have some, in terms of financing, Indian connections, but it's largely a production of India, a US, an Italian, a French, and a German production company. Meera Nair did begin her career making films in India, documentaries, but mostly has been based outside of the US, even though she went to India to make this film. And then maybe even more category confusion is created by this film, which is, many people think if they've seen an Indian film, this is likely the film they've seen. But this is best understood, again, if you follow the money, you follow the source of the production, you follow, the copyrights and the director. This is a British film with U.S. backing. Yes, filmed in India. Yes, an Indian-based story with Indian actors. But in some sense, in the way we categorize a film, often in terms of production origins, the money, the financing, not an Indian film. But this is a fascinating category in and of itself, what I'm going to call broadly diasporic films, films made often by creators with roots in India, but often located in different parts of the world, and then often on Indian topics. And then there's a case of films that are, in every way we define such things, Indian productions, made in India, starring Indian actors, Indian creative talent, Indian financing, but that we might think of as globalized. Films that are, including these two, that are set in the United States, set in New York. It's been popular for some time to film Indian films in different parts of the world. Traditionally, the U.S. was not one of those locations, but it's become increasingly prevalent as a site for films set in the United States, involving the status of Indians in the United States, but more or less not seen by U.S. film viewers, made for an Indian audience, despite the story and setting. I'll come back to one of these in a bit. And I should say, I'm not going to do a complete discussion of this, but Indian films have played historically in parts of the world. At different times, Indian films were extremely popular in the Soviet Union. They were extremely popular in China. They have a history of playing in parts of Africa. They have a history of playing in Greece, other parts of the world. There is, in fact, a longer history than people often recognized of Indian films playing in the UK. That goes back at least to the 1940s, if not earlier. This is a recent, relatively recent popular Hindi film. It's actually also set in New York. This is a poster for the French release of the film. The film in French is known as Indian Love Story. That's the French title, despite its being English. When it played in the US, it was released as Kal Ho Na Ho. So,
It does not translate to Indian Love Story.
no, and not a translation, direct translation. So I'm going to just after confusing you with all of that, which is to say, I just want to say the category of Indian cinema itself is this quite elusive one. It's complicated historically. It's complicated across the different regional cinemas. It's complicated because of what I'm calling, again, diasporic films that aren't really Indian in some sense, but are important in the way India represents itself or is represented. I'm going to focus on my main interest and the what's usually not seen as a regional cinema, but the dominant popular mainstream commercial cinema, Hindi cinema, produced in Bombay. And here two major examples. But that forces me now to confront this term, Bollywood. Bollywood refers to popular Hindi, and there's probably nobody in this room who needs this clarification, but if anyone has ever taught Hindi cinema, this is what you learn. You correct first on student papers, not Hindu, the religion, but Hindi, the language. Popular Hindi cinema, produced in Bombay, now officially Mumbai, acquired this name. There's some mystery over how this happened and exactly when this happened. It probably arose with a journalist being clever, that they attached, to Bombay, Bollywood. I have my own difficulties with the term. There's a lot of debate on the term. It's often viewed as condescending. It's often viewed as trivializing. It clearly is modeled on the notion that Hollywood comes first, and then we have Bollywood. But it's, for me and other scholars who have some trouble with the term, it's a losing battle. It's become the known, popular, visible term. And so here I have a couple of scholarly works recently where, again, the term is ubiquitous. Publishers expect it in the titles of books dealing with Indian cinema, sometimes for good reason. It's specifically on popular Hindi cinema, but it also has become an increasingly fuzzy term. And I'm going to say just a little more about that. Part of its visibility, if anything, has made popular Indian cinema visible in the United States, if not the world. It's probably that category. But as you can see here, it's attached itself to other things now. So I often hear from people who also know what I work on. They'll say, oh, I'm taking a Bollywood exercise class, or I went to a Bollywood dance performance, which people do dance in the film, so there's some connection. But oh, I saw this in San Francisco. I saw that there's a Bollywood party being thrown. It's become this signifier that moves around and attaches to different things that may or may not be very related to the cinema. And it's become this kind of curious reference point for things that may extend apart from it. So this exhibition found the need to call itself Bollywood and Beyond. Beyond is just everything else. Anything that isn't Hindi cinema but is vaguely related because it's also Indian gets attached there too. Friends of mine, scholars of Indian cinema who are historically sensitive, are particularly troubled by the way in which the term, which arose in the 70s, it seems, if it has a birth date, it's probably the 1970s, and it was meant to describe a certain kind of film that particularly became prominent then. what is sometimes called the masala formula, a multi-genre, a little bit of singing and dancing, some comedy, some action, romance, featuring prominently songs. It refers to a certain kind of film, which in fact is characteristic at one level across Indian popular cinemas, but also is historical. It doesn't describe very well popular cinema of the 1930s or maybe 1940s or earlier, but it now gets used retroactively. So sometimes the very earliest Indian films we have from the teens are described as the first Bollywood films in a way that makes no sense. Or Tamil or Telugu or Malayalam films are described as Bollywood films in a way that makes no sense, wrenched away from the context of Bombay. So one of the things that you find frequently here, again, two scholarly works. A scholar who wants to talk about Indian cinema before the concept of Bollywood is forced to call her book Bombay Before Bollywood. A scholar who wants to talk about, this is mostly on diasporic films, finds the need to call her book Beyond Bollywood. So this is what I mean. It becomes this reference point or this touchstone, even if you want to talk about things other than it. And so it has become a term that people are familiar with. It has become a term that makes people aware of popular Indian cinema in a way they weren't before. They've got at least this vague or even sometimes more specific understanding of a body of work that they're talking about. But again, it often gets used misleadingly. I mentioned this already, but this is just maybe I'm not being fair here because this is just an information site on the internet, and we all know how trustworthy those can be. But this, someone might go to this site seeking this basic information, and you probably can't read here. It says, the world's largest film industry belongs to India. It is known as Bollywood. Bollywood releases closer, it's not grammatical, closer to 1,000 films each year. And one of the cliches, but one of those cliches that happens to be true about the Indian film industry is it is the world's largest film industry. It does release more films every year. But the total number, if you recall that slide I showed you before, it's the total number in all the languages. So if Bollywood is Hindi cinema, it's large, but it's not that large. It's the combined production in India. This is not very up to date. This is 2002, but I could find up to date statistics on the US and India, and I couldn't find anything more recent on China, and I wanted to include China for comparison here. So in 2012, the US released again, these are, the edges of these may be a little frayed, but more or less accurate. The US released 476 films. India released 1,602. In the middle, China released 745. The real story here, in some sense, particularly if you're paying attention to the political economy of this situation, is India sells twice as many tickets as US films, over 2 billion tickets sold, double the attendance, but the other numbers. India makes 1/10 of the gross income of the US. It's a lot cheaper to see a film in India than it is to see an American film almost anywhere in the world, but particularly in the US. So what looks like this dominance on the one hand, they make so many more films, is put into perspective by the economic reality. $1 billion is nothing to sneeze at. This is a large industry, but at the same time, in comparison, significantly smaller. So I've sometimes argued that we really ought to take Indian cinema as the norm. There are more of them than there are American films, though American film tends to play the role of the norm. But in real world terms, the US absolutely dominates because of its economic clout in this regard. So just to remind you again of that number, 234 films that could be identified as Bollywood, but these claims are made. Bollywood is the world's biggest film industry. The claims conflate. This is the other problem with the term Bollywood. They conflate the entirety of Indian cinema into this one term. leaving out again, and you'll see, Telugu and Tamil cinema are in any given year running kind of neck and neck with Hindi production. Those three are the three consistently large cinemas of India. Okay. So back to a topic I mentioned before. What happened some time ago, and to me curiously has continued, is that Indian art cinema, I'm referring somewhat to my training as a film student, but then also to the way in which in more popular domains this is also the case. Indian art cinema found a toehold in the West, particularly with the films of the Bengali filmmaker, master filmmaker, I have no question about his deserved status, Satyajit Ray, and particularly this series of films made near the beginning of his career, known now as the Apu trilogy. Mother India, in fact, one of the sort of legendary films of popular Hindi cinema, often, I don't like these comparisons, but often described as the Gone with the Wind of Indian cinema, kind of great nationalist epic, played in the United States. This is almost forgotten now. It played in a version that was cut down. Songs were removed from it. It was nominated for an Academy Award. This is almost an unknown fact, even among film scholars, that this film actually had a U.S. visibility at one time in the 1950s. The Apu, the first film, Padar Panchali in the Apu trilogy, premiered at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It opened in the United States before playing, except to sort of small groups that Ray showed it to, before playing commercially in India. It was part of a big festival of Indian culture. And I can't take the time for the full story, but someone found that there was this young Indian filmmaker in Calcutta who was working on this, what looked like a very interesting film, and he was contacted to make his film available for this conference, and then this sort of launches his career. And Indian art cinema, these are from a British cinema, but Indian art cinema found a location in the West, but, and again, I don't mean this to be a complaint about a very great filmmaker who made really wonderful films, but to put it in an almost crude way, it's almost as if the decision was made to find one Indian filmmaker, and that was sufficient. That was necessary, all that was necessary. If there were others or more films, that didn't seem worth seeking out. This happened roughly, some of you may know, for Japan in the same period. In the 1950s, Akira Kurosawa was discovered. And for a shorter time, Akira Kurosawa was Japanese cinema. The fact that Kurosawa was making films in sort of the third or fourth generation of Japanese cinema, that he had important precursors, that he had important mentors, was kind of left out of the story until later. The West kind of played catch up with the fact that there were at least two major filmmakers, Mizoguchi and Ozu, before Kurosawa. That didn't quite happen with Ray. He remained for quite a long period, and I don't know if you can see where you're sitting, but he's advertised as India's greatest director. This decision had been made, I think it's safe to say, by people who probably hadn't seen any other Indian films, that he's clearly their greatest director. That's used to advertise this film, an outstanding new film by India's greatest director, and then it was decided that his first film is India's greatest film. Once again, far from me to question the greatness of this film. It is a great film, but that it occupied this sort of undocumented consensual status that we all agree. And I'm being a little mean to these people, but I really think the situation was often, well, we really haven't seen any others, but this is a good one, so let's decide that it has that status. And he remains, and again, at some level, deservedly, he remains celebrated in the West as the exemplar of Indian cinema. I've tried to explain how this functions in reverse, and I need to come up with a reference that's better known to people, but I've often compared this to, are any of you familiar with the films of John Cassavetes? Low budget, gritty, improvisational, realist films. A well-known actor in other films, but his own films are these sort of icons of American independent cinema. I often say that the status of Ray as representing Indian cinema would be something like if someone said, tell me about American cinema. What is American cinema like? And I said, John Cassavetes. That's American cinema. Leaving out Westerns, musicals, horror films, science fiction, leaving out this vast body of American cinema, including popular cinema, to say, well, that captures it. And so Ray has a kind of masterful status in his native Bengal and in Calcutta, but it turns out these were not widely seen in India. These were films primarily seen by intellectuals, not seen or not popular with mass audiences, and they did come to represent a whole. They came to represent, a massive body of other material, which it was always implicit for the while wasn't worth looking at. Oh, there are also those song and dance films, those popular films, but this is the real thing. So again, I don't really mean this to be directed at him. It's more the way in which this was allowed to happen. This has meant that his films, just recently, and this was a very difficult thing to do. The people who did this deserve great credit, but this film got an elaborate these three films got an elaborate restoration. They were re-released. They played at Filmscene, among other places, to great acclaim. They've now been released in a very luxurious DVD or Blu-ray set from the company Criterion, which is known for its kind of high-quality releases. And then they've also released other films by Ray. They have never, in their vast catalog, released a popular commercial Hindi film. They, too, have continued this notion that, in effect, there is one Indian filmmaker whose bodies of films are worth of this special care and treatment and presentation. So what I want to finish talking about is what seems to me the situation that we've got something like a separate cinema. In the United States, Hindi films, Indian films, do exist, do play, are available, but in a way that functions as a curious kind of alternative cinema or almost underground cinema. Although we tend to associate the underground with sort of, hipsters in a way. We're talking about an underground that is, grandmothers and aunts and uncles and families and kids. We're not talking about an alternative in that sense. This is, you probably can't see, this is a program for the NAS 8 Cinema, which was a multiplex in California. It's closed now. But they emphasize, and I can't read actually where I am either, they call it multicultural cinema. India's, or Southern California's showcase for multicultural cinema. It's all India. So it is different languages, so it's multicultural in that sense, but it's not multinational. And this cinema, which for a long time operated, very effectively, very profitably, again, tends to be off the radar, or was when it existed, off the radar of most Americans who just didn't know this or other cinemas in other locations with large South Asian populations existed. The other place where Indian cinema, particularly on video, exists and thrives is in diasporic South Asian markets. So we don't have them anymore, of course, but not video stores, not at Blockbuster, but at the markets. This is one on Devon in Chicago that serve, or neighborhoods at least, that serve multiple functions. So food markets, places to buy saris, places to buy spices, and then places to get music and video. But again, my experience of now for over a decade or more going to these shops to shop is when I go in, and unless I'm known there, some places know me now, they know me as the person who wants old films, by which the kids working there mean films from the 70s. I'm looking for the 30s, and they say, you want old films? And, this is 10 years old. But the other, when I go into a shop I'm not familiar with, I'm almost always told, as this white guy, I'm told, oh, sir, this is just Indian films. Clearly you're in the wrong place. Clearly you've wandered in, not knowing what we've got here. These are Indian films. And I have to clarify, well, believe it or not, I'm actually interested in Indian films. But this exists as, again, a kind of separate, isolated market, not fully integrated except in maybe a touristic way sometimes with the people who might go to this area to eat in a nice restaurant and realize, oh, there's a kind of music shop or a video shop on the block. Maybe I'll take a look in there. So let me just give you a couple of concrete examples and try to finish up. This recent film from last year, Dangal. Dangal is a wrestling ring. This is a film about a father who raises two daughters to be wrestlers. Was a massive hit. It opened in 331 screens in North America, US and Canada, last December. In this odd case, it opened 2 days before it opened in India. Opening at the end of the year is a sign of a big film, a film expected to be very big. The trailer for the film is widely viewed within a few weeks by at least 38 million people. A music video for the film is viewed by millions of people soon after it appears. It eventually becomes the highest grossing domestic film in Indian history. And the second highest internationally. It makes, this is just a few months ago, it makes worldwide $110 million. The record is held by a film from just a few years ago, starring the same star, that made $120 million. Now, again, I'm guessing most of you have not heard of one of the most successful films of all time, made last year. That showed in 300 cinemas near you, in this country. You may not know, because this is not advertised to an audience that is not presumed to be interested in this, that right now, this week, today, in Cedar Rapids, you can see a Telugu film that is showing. In Des Moines and in Davenport, you can choose from one Hindi film, two Telugu films, and a Tamil film, all showing right now. Not advertised in local papers, not advertised for an audience that is not presumed to have any interest in these films. So these films surround us. This isn't just Chicago or Los Angeles or Atlanta. These are theaters in Iowa. There's a number of places online where you can look up what's showing. And again, we seem to be oblivious to these. This recent film, just released a few weeks ago, has also done enormously well. It's on the road toward being one of the most successful films of all time as well. It opened in 265 North American cinemas, including some of the ones I just showed you. It played. And in a very short period, it's already grossed around 11 million, and it's still playing in some theaters, so it's likely to go higher. It stars this man, Shah Rukh Khan, who the BBC, at least at one point, the BBC, not an Indian company, the BBC determined was the most popular star in the world. He likely is. He's probably one of the most famous people on the planet. He has been feted at locations like Yale University, among others, but there are limits to this fame. One of the most common stories about Shah Rukh Khan in recent years is that every time he comes to the United States, he's detained. And if this doesn't get on the US radar, it obsesses Indian media. So you can, Shah Rukh Khan detained, US apologizes, Shah Rukh Khan detained at Los Angeles airport. It's big breaking news whenever it occurs, and it occurs all too often. He has somewhat politely tweeted, I fully understand and respect security with the way the world is, but to be detained at US immigration every damn time really, really sucks. He is, he is arguably one of the most famous people on the planet, except at US airports, where his name his name, Khan, makes him suspect. There's been just to finish up, there's been this long discussion of when will Indian cinema or an Indian star cross over? When will they achieve the, elusive success in America? There's a quotation I've always liked that someone I showed a picture of, the superstar, still very, very prominent, superstar of the 1970s, Amitabh Bachchan, was asked once, why don't you go to Hollywood? Why don't you make a Hollywood film? Why don't you go to Hollywood? And very smartly, he said, I'm a hero, which is the common term in India for a leading man. I'm a hero. Why do I want to be a brown sidekick? And I think it was smart on his part. He wouldn't be asked to lead a film. He would be put in a secondary role. He has about 1 billion fans. So why go to the US, although that supposedly marks a certain kind of success, and take these sort of minor roles? It's now, but we've seen versions of this before, it's likely that this woman, Priyanka Chopra, might be the one to do this. But I'm raising a question about whether this is even something worth doing. She stars on a TV show right now, Quantico. She is about to appear, whether this is a good thing or not, in the forthcoming Baywatch film with The Rock. And she is likely to achieve a kind of Western, global, international status that very few Indian film stars have. My question is, does the crossing over will it encourage people to go back? She's made dozens, if not 100 or so Hindi films, some of them huge hits. But I don't know that her success in the West is going to ensure that even her most fervent fans go back and watch her earlier films. I don't know that it will translate into this kind of dialogue between the two countries. So I'm going to leave you with just the ongoing question of whether one of the Indian film distributors promises that what they're providing is from Bollywood to your hood. So I took their line, but whether this ongoing puzzle of whether Indian cinema, popular Indian cinema, will ever achieve a kind of visibility in the United States remains to me a kind of puzzle. So.
As is often the case when I'm allowed to host, I like to ask the first question, so pardon me. The burning question in my mind as you were talking, Corey, is online streaming such as Netflix, good, bad, or indifferent when it comes to helping make Indian cinema more accessible to a U.S. audience?
Yes, and I probably betray my old-fashioned biases where I still think of cinema as something you see at a movie theater. But there's no question that whole range of availability on DVD, which when that first happened was unprecedented. These films were hard to get, hard to see in the West. There was circulation on VHS in very poor copies, often unsubtitled. DVD changed things enormously in that regard. And then the shift to streaming and other sources. Netflix actually has a pretty healthy selection of Indian cinema and a range of Indian cinema, not just popular Hindi. It can be a little hard to find. You sometimes have to dig for it, but if you know the way Netflix works, once you find some, it will alert you to others. Indian cinema has a massive presence on the web, which again it did not have at one point. I decided for various reasons for this presentation not to show clips of anything because again I was talking less about the films. But if you've never looked, go to YouTube and you can find thousands and thousands of clips, including whole films, but trailers and songs. And if you've never gotten a taste of this, there's plenty there. So in that regard, just at the sheer level of access, if it was ever a reasonable excuse for people to say, well, I don't know how to find it. I don't, there's nothing in my neighborhood, or there's no cinema near me showing these films. That's just not true anymore. I mean, you can't say it's not at your fingertip. But at the same time, I still think there's the assumption that, it's the diasporic audience, or what's sometimes called the NRI, non-resident Indian audience. That's who's interested in these. There's little interest otherwise than that. So it's there, but I'm not sure it gets viewed anymore in any more significant numbers. How do we do this? We need the mic. Right?
Professor Creekmur, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. We have several questions from the audience, and I'll ask these questions on behalf of the audience. Does Hindi cinema dominate or influence Indian cinema in general? And are there film remakes across Indian languages? I know the answer, but I'm asking on behalf of...
I'll answer the last one, the easy one. Yes, there are a lot of remakes, including a lot of remakes across languages, and remakes of Hollywood films and non-U.S. films. Some Indian films get remade in other locations, like Hong Kong. So a lot of remakes, most of them unofficial. Most of them without paying the rights to make remakes. The first part is trickier. Hindi cinema is often seen to dominate. I should have clarified, Hindi cinema is produced in Bombay, which is in the state of Maharashtra, where the language is Marathi. There's a Marathi cinema, significant cinema. So you do have the curious, has to do with the history of Bombay, but you do have the curious history of within a state that has an official language, you do have this Hindi language popular cinema. It is often felt to dominate. A common kind of claim is it is the equivalent of Hollywood cinema for South Asia in the way that it dominates. That's kind of true. It certainly, the whole structure of saying Bollywood and regional, so identifying Tamil and Telugu cinema as regional cinemas despite their size, it gives you some sense of that. But in sheer numbers, it doesn't always. It certainly doesn't dominate the South. It probably does dominate North India. And it for a long time, dominated any cinema that traveled outside of India. But when I showed you those Iowa theaters, now Tamil and Telugu cinema is playing in these theaters in a way that wasn't true 10 years ago, where almost any film that played in the U.S., except an art film, would be a Hindi film. But that's not true anymore. Hindi cinema vies for attention from particularly Tamil and Telugu films now in these local markets.
Another interesting question. Would an Indian moviegoer, I'm assuming Indian as in Indian or Indian American, Indian moviegoer, consider films such as Monsoon Wedding or Slumdog Millionaire to be Indian films or not?
No. This is not to say, Indian viewers are not interested in those films, but the easy response to Slumdog Millionaire is the reason it's clearly not an Indian film is it has no songs. There's one at the end, and you get the sense the filmmakers thought, well, we've got to figure out how to attach a song. So they do it in a kind of after-fact way. But the fact that the film is not itself interspersed with songs is one of the first signs it just isn't an Indian film in that formal sense. And Monsoon Wedding, though it does have songs, they're integrated in a kind of realistic way. I like Monsoon Wedding, but I get the sense that she wanted songs, but given her Western ties, she just couldn't go the full route and have song sequences. She had to figure out a kind of, songs are played at weddings, so she had to figure out a realistic way to embed the songs, but not go the full route. And I didn't mention this, but the norm for Indian films is 3 hours. That's the standard running time. Our films are short. Remember, most of the films made in the world are 3 hours. So you have to adjust your perception to think, well, 2 hours is the norm. Not really by the numbers, it isn't. And both of those films conform to the expectations of Western filmgoers that films should be about 90 minutes to 2 hours. They don't have a break, which in India is called the interval, and which is used. And it's not just, it's a long film, we should take a break, but the interval gets used in creative ways. Often there's a sort of cliffhanger. At the interval, you take a break, come back and get the resolution. They don't have that element as well. So in certain formal ways, they don't function as Indian cinema, despite being set in India and telling Indian stories.
Can I ask a couple more questions? So are the films playing in nearby theaters like Cedar Rapids subtitled? The answer I can tell you is yes, but those are poorly subtitled, actually.
Wasn't always true, but increasingly subtitling
Yes.
is going.
But if you know the original language, it's not, I mean, good scholars would not call them well subtitled. How big is Nollywood? Because Bollywood films are so popular in Africa. How are Nigerian films or Nollywood in comparison to Hollywood and Bollywood? Is that like...
I'm trying to think of being very efficient. Nollywood is a fascinating and complicated distinction. Nollywood is Nigerian cinema. It's not actually cinema. It's video. They're made on video and distributed on video. They're not shown in movie theaters. And it's large, but part of the situation is these films can be, you can have a film made on video, often made in a day, 2 days. Many of them look kind of like soap operas, often just kind of discussions. There's no budget for action scenes and things like that. You can have a film that is made and released, as it were, made available to people, whether legally or on pirate copies, on a Friday. And if it's a big hit that weekend, if people really like it, part 2 comes out a week later. And so it just operates on a different scale in a way. It apparently was created because, if this is true, it's just terribly sad to me. There are no movie theaters in Nigeria, no operating movie theaters, and so this is an entirely watch in your home or watch you in some group location. So it's large in terms of numbers. The economics of it are vastly different, much more small scale in that regard. That's a quick answer on a complicated situation.
Okay, this is the last question. It's kind of complicated. Do you think the trend in America to call out cultural appropriation steers curious Americans away from looking outside their cultural bloc?
Oh, that is complicated. There is a general sense, and even referring to the art cinema as I did before, there is a general sense that Americans view fewer non-U.S. films than maybe ever before. That, say in the 60s, which was probably a high point, but into the 70s, a lot of Americans, not the vast majority, but a lot of Americans would see Swedish films, Bergman, Italian films, Fellini, films from around the world, Japanese films at a certain point. That's less and less true. More is available on video than was available at that point, but it's very difficult for a non-U.S., non-English language film to be successful, except in New York, Los Angeles, and even then for a very limited run. Some of them will do better on video. But so I don't know that answers this question of appropriation exactly, but I do think, just based on my own observations, my own students, that we've gotten narrower about what we will view in that regard, which is a sad thing. I am on the board of Filmscene. Filmscene shows a lot of non-U.S. films. Go see them. But not enough Indian films. Yeah. Well, again, I wish I could have pointed to, I said Cedar Rapids, Davenport, Des Moines. I wish I could have said Iowa City. The Sycamore Mall Cinema, you may not know, is catering to a local Chinese audience and shows Chinese films. Not advertised on the assumption that if you're not Chinese, you have any interest in seeing them. They're often shown, this used to be true for Indian films, they're often shown at awkward times. I've been to Cedar Rapids to see an Indian film at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, because that's when they could book the cinema. The cinema wants to show its movies the rest of the day. That's less true now. These are showing at more mainstream times. But the Sycamore Cinema shows Chinese films, during the day on Tuesday or something like that. So not part of their regular visible programming. But they're aware there's an audience there. What's always curious to me, again, is this notion that But it's a select, limited niche audience, that there's not an attempt to address more people. And again, the fact that a lot of Indian films were released in the U.S. without subtitles was, forbidding to people who wanted to. You can often follow what's going along, but people wanted, the aid of the subtitles. That changed some time ago. This was a long time ago, but I asked a video distributor why they were putting subtitles on films, which they hadn't before, or they used to put them on dialogue but not songs. And I asked why they were doing that, and they said, this was for the company Eros, which is a big distributor, for the children of diasporic Indians who needed to learn. Now, this is an amazing change in Indian culture, that now Hindi films were part of the heritage. They were often shunned by Indian intellectuals. Now they were part of the cultural heritage, and these children were not learning Hindi, and so they needed the subtitles. There was no sense that, for non-Indians. That wasn't the assumption of who needed subtitles. It was for these kids growing up in America or the UK who didn't know proper Hindi. So. Thanks.
We now conclude our program, and thanks so much today's presenter, Corey Creekmur, for a really interesting look at the Indian film industry in the United States, or lack thereof. I also would like to say thank you to our sponsors, the University of Iowa International Programs, University of Iowa Honors Program, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, financial sponsors, special sponsors today, Usha R. Balakrishnan, thank you, and Midwest One Bank. And we thank City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. Corey, we'd like to present you with this coveted cup of the Iowa City
Thank you.
Foreign Relations Council as a small token of our thanks. And thank you to all of us for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week, hopefully, or sometime very soon. Thanks.